going to look at questions around silence in the Decade of Centenaries, things that are missing, I think, from the Decade of Centenaries, or things that have been missing perhaps, or that have been omitted, and the politics of the archive, and discussions around debates about the archive and its nature during the Decade of Centenaries. I'm thrilled to be joined by Caelainn Hogan, who is a journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, Vice Magazine, on Al Jazeera, in the Irish Times and the Dublin Review, among others, and she is also the author of Republic of Shame. Síobhra Aiken is lecturer I Síobhra I Rin na Gaeilge agus an Líon Chéile in Ollscoil na Banríona, Belfast. Síobhra is a lecturer in the Department of Irish and Celtic Studies at Queen's University Belfast. Stephen O'Neill is the Irish Research Council Enterprise Fellow at the School of English at Trinity College Dublin, and also at the Irish Museum of Modern Art. I'm going to ask Stephen to open proceedings this afternoon, and he will be looking at the issue of the archive, its role in the Decade of Centenaries, and its, I no doubt, problematic place in the Decade of Centenaries as a political project.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, UCD, my erstwhile employers, and everyone else for being here. And everyone online, of course, as well. I feel like I'm a TV host now, so that's great as well. So I thought I'd do something a bit different today. I've been talking about partition for the past, as I said to Donald there, 34 years, so I am 34. So it wasn't my first word, but it might have been one of them. But to talk a little bit about the archive, something that sort of baffled me as someone who's a literary kind of, and basically has transitioning into an art historian, or trying to at least anyway. We'll see how that works. Thinking more about the representation of the archive. Not to say that I'm someone who either doesn't like the archive, doesn't use the archive, as we'll find out in a bit. I actually did find something on Monday, which was quite interesting in relation to this. And also not to kind of, throw all archival historians under the bus. Some of my best friends are archival historians, and I don't wish to do that. But to think about how, this narrative of the archive has been foregrounded by the Decade of Commemorations, which I'll maybe get to in a second. In particular, of course, this image, or one of the images of the destruction of the Public Records Office, is the forecourts, which was, of course, spectacular and devastating in June 1922, and has, I think, frequently arrested the attention of writers, journalists and historians in the Decade of Commemorations. It's unsurprising that this is so. The incident had all the hallmarks of a classic literary, or indeed cinematic, set piece, an explosion of a celebrated Georgian landmark in the centre of Dublin, marking the first major engagement, or one of the first major engagements in the Irish Civil War, the borrowed artillery of the British state being turned against former comrades by the Free State Army. But in particular, the fact that the Public Record Office was destroyed has been the source of much lamentation in the ensuing century, the beginning of the state, also the end for some of its memory. So the imagistic quality to the 20th of June, or what happened between 20th and 30th of June 1922 was noticed, of course, at the time. The British Pathé newsreels demonstrate crowds of people gathering to watch the spectacle of the shelling, and an array of photographs exist of the buildings being bombarded and going up in flames. The quality was also noted famously in Ernie O'Malley's eyewitness description of the fire from the windows of the building he had taken operational command of. Thick black cloud floated up about the buildings and drifted away slowly. Fluttering up and down against the black mass were leaves of white paper. They looked like hovering white birds. Now this is what usually gets quoted in most journalistic, but then what doesn't get quoted is this part, which is, "A half-burnt broken volume fell at my feet. I picked it up, an account of the Secret Service money paid by Dublin Castle to informers in the year 1798. I thought in 100 years' time, will the new Records Office contain an account of the Secret Service money paid out in 1922? Which I think is quite an interesting thought that, at the minute to think about in 2022, and I might get to that at the end. So O'Malley's account of the destruction was obviously, and his kind of take on it, I suppose, is obviously hotly contested since. The political historian Tom Garvin, for example, in the year 2000, delivered one of the most strident lamentations of the destruction, blaming O'Malley essentially and his comrades, saying that it constituted an attempt to murder the nation as a collective entity with a collective memory. So Garvin's condemnation of this act, this is obviously foregrounding the Decade of Commemorations, but this act is essentially an anti-intellectual act. It's one bolstered by comparison for him with the actions of the Provisional IRA in 1994, when 2 volunteers destroyed some 1,000 books in Belfast and Hull Library. So there's a slippage already in that description between the past and the present, which I think is obviously at work at times whenever people talk about the Four Courts in relation to that. Quite who was to blame for this erasure, or exactly how it happened, is less the point for me than what come to fill the void, or what has come to fill the void in the decade of commemorations of this loss. So the irresistible imagery of the Four Courts on fire has frequently furnished reflections on the state of Irish archives in the present day, indeed often by Irish archivists and archival historians themselves. 2 recent examples bear this out. In a really comprehensive and I think magisterial article on Irish literary archives, the Emory professor and creator Geraldine Higgins described an Ireland still coming to terms with the loss of its material history, claiming that the birth of the nation coincided with the death of this history. Again, the slippage between nation and state is quite clearly foregrounded here, and this is kind of obviously a huge sort of trope across the decade of commemorations as well. But importantly, there's a self-reflexive and locational critique of the archive throughout this essay. So it's not just saying, this is what the archives were, it's also kind of reflecting on how the archive is determined by material and kind of economic factors as well. Likewise, the mass reconstruction effort of Trinity College's kind of transformational initiative beyond 2022, which is really their flagship kind of historical thing in the past sort of decade as well, is in itself framed by a hauntology of reconstruction as an act of commemoration. With the project predicated on replacing the archives lost in the fire, or the records lost in the fire I should say, it also includes a virtual reality model of the Public Records Office as it stood in 1922, and is due to be launched next month on the anniversary of the building's partial destruction on 30th of June. So there's a certain commemoration even in terms of the restoration as well. It's according to a certain calendar. And littered throughout the project's public engagements are generally hagiographical descriptions of the former keepers of the records and a general admiration for the quality of the architecture of the destroyed buildings itself, and characteristic really of many responses to the revolutionary period, which displayed a nostalgia for buildings that Yeats would say a haughtier age designed. So in the context of beyond 2022, all of these rhetorical flourishes are of course part of a necessary argument, and I think also a self-promotion for what is already a kind of transformational intervention in the way that Irish records are conceived, and how, if you like, Irish history is done and how it will be done. And you think about what a future, like a shared future might be, this is clearly one of those initiatives that is trying to kind of at least enact that. But this turn towards the archives, as Higgins notes, has been a major aspect of the discourse around the Decade of Centenaries, which is frequently focused on how Irish institutions collect, preserve and display the material traces of the past in Ireland, and also renewed our attention to the ways in which our socially constructed institutions have the power to privilege and marginalise, as well as preserve and promote ideas of national heritage, belonging and exclusion. Again, another exclusion here, which I've already sort of signposted, is the kind of exclusion of sort of the state and the nation. This idea of the slippage there, obviously leaving out a certain jurisdiction in the north. And back to partition again. Another, I think, is the routine representation of the archive, especially the lost archive of the Public Records Office, as a fundamentally neutral source of data and knowledge, or at least a fundamentally, I suppose, objective source of data and knowledge. In 2012, for example, the head of special projects at the National Archives, Katrina Crowe, contributed a piece on the 90th anniversary of the public record destruction. So not just a decade of centenaries apparently, but also a decade of 90th anniversaries. And also blaming the anti-treaty IRA for the destruction of the records, Crowe was at pains to point out what she called the Herculean efforts of her predecessors in the National Archives in finding replacement for records that had been destroyed. Again, the adjectives that are being used restate and re-emphasise the labour of the archivist, and there's never anything other than a really Herculean or heroically constructed archive, or maybe a lazily one. It's never just an archive. But she's also concerned with the idea of history as a specific discipline. How many potential MAs, PhDs, articles and books went up in smoke that day along with the records, and what damage was done to the burgeoning project of writing Irish history based on evidential primary sources. I would contend that quite a few history PhDs, MAs and books have been written about the Four Courts in the Civil War actually, but that there's a particular type of history which is being asked for here, and a particular type of history which is clearly that of an archivist as opposed to one necessarily not necessarily not an archivist one either, but one which is very clearly saying that these records could have been kind of productions of knowledge. The overwhelming focus, anyway, on the four courts, as demonstrated by Crowe particularly, is understandable given how spectacular the event was. And she is kind of, over the course of the Decade of Commemorations, essentially given the same talk with slightly different emphasis. In one case saying nobody gave a damn about the public records. But I think this also overshadows other acts of suppression and forgetting, some of which were more deliberate, which I'll get into in a second. But the nostalgia for the archive is also used to relitigate, as with Garvin, the blame for their destruction. So Ronan McGreevy's most recent article on this, for example, framed it as again, the destruction, framed as it is again, the destruction of four courts. I mean, even again, the image of equality in this particular insert from the Irish Times, it restates many of these essential facts. The list of documents that were stored in the office's record treasury departments are contained in a single 300-page manuscript, which fortunately survived the fire. This unpublished book, compiled in 1919 by Herbert Wood, the Deputy Keeper of the Public Records Office, was described as the most depressing in Irish history because it chronicles so many priceless documents that were incinerated. So this is actually a preservation too far, right? In describing a book published well before the destruction of the office, it was actually published in 1919 as a manuscript that was rescued from it. Once again, we're foregrounding the heroism of kind of these documents being kind of being preserved. But it also reveals something about the ways in which archivism is kind of foregrounded in this way. Thankfully, because of Beyond 22 and because of National Archives, we actually do have this, but there's also, a copy of it in the British Library. There's a copy of it in a few places. It was actually widely published before. So this kind of fake manuscript, described as the most depressing book in Ireland, is actually probably more depressing than just about what it actually is talking about having lost. Wood's account of these records in itself demonstrates a colonial attitude towards Irish memory, both in terms of seeking to preserve and control knowledge and documents, but also offering a history of the archives as embattled by the native. In fact, the document itself is a lamentation of loss even from the start. The attention of the government was frequently called to the unsatisfactory condition in which the public archives were kept. As far as the Irish archives are concerned, the 16th and 17th centuries are almost a blank. But also justifying, I think importantly, the preservation of the records within kind of the Dublin Castle complex initially, the very storing of the records of preservation from the native, as he terms it. By a sudden descent of the natives from the mountains at a time when the Justiciar and his forces were engaging the enemy in Wicklow in the 14th century, the Exchequer and many of the records were destroyed. I mean, I don't mean to get all Walter Benjamin on everyone, but of course there is no document of civilization, which is at one time a document of barbarity. And here we have something which I don't think has really been commented on at all in terms of this most depressing book in Irish history. And it makes this...
Just a couple of minutes, Stephen.
Okay, yeah, I'm on the way.
Right.
So I think this kind of leads to the question, like whether what was destroyed is really national memory. I mean, these are very slippery terms anyway. Are they national memory, or are they documents of the technology of colonial surveillance? Are they documents of colonialism? I mean, Ernie O'Malley was certainly clear about what they were, right? So that's something we might need to think about. But also that memory loss and document loss is not necessarily unproductive, regardless of anything else. I'm not going to get into my own archival story, but I was doing something else on Monday, looking for reviews of Benedict Kiley's Counties of Contention. Despite the fact that I'm in UCD, I'm not going to recommend everyone reads it, but forthcoming in a book, which maybe someone will read. The author of this book pleads that the disagreements of Ulster with Éire do not go back beyond William of Orange and not much back beyond Lord Carson. Facts drawn from the documents destroyed in the Public Record Office in Dublin in 1922 abundantly demonstrate, however, that the differences between Ulster and Éire are fundamentally racial and not religious, for they existed long before 1500. So this idea of being able to read documents that no one else can because they've been destroyed, there's a memory of something and a kind of reading that's being remembered that is used as a kind of argument against partition. And I think I was going to talk about this. I won't have time because I want to make a sort of important point given the day that we're talking about. I mean, Donald was talking about, say, the idea of, say, Micheál Martin's resistance to post-colonialism, that global frame. I think we can learn a lot from that. I'm just going to leave that up and we can maybe talk about it afterwards. But I also want to think about commemoration and state control and the constant kind of like reconfiguration of the destruction, the kind of aesthetic appeal of the incident of the Four Courts, and the fact that it was actually a mass spectator event. There's something kind of different going on in the archives in a mass spectator event, which you might explore afterwards. But all of these suggest something somewhat contradictory to the kind of, the sort of printed and sort of enclosed order of an archive as such. But the Four Courts fixation also, I think, exonerates the colonial aspects of the British administration of Ireland, past and present. If 1922 is the great loss in Irish memory, it was soon joined by other losses like the suppression of the treaty debates for 50 years, the burial of the report of the Boundary Commission, for 50 years as well, which was literally said so that it should be forgotten and no one should remember how this happened. And also the continued, in this day, refusal to release the files of the Ulster Special Constabulary. These are only some that I know from my own research, but I'm sure everybody else will have a few others. And then also, I think, just to sort of finish and think about kind of the past sort of 48 hours, a concerted effort to conceal files from state victims of the Northern Conflict, while also commissioning an official history with approved access to those archives. If we sort of talk about like archival history, in other words, then we can't just do it in this kind of neutral and kind of, I think, blind to the kind of state way that we continue to do. And maybe that's where something like the instituting impulse of an archive that Mbebe talks about might help us to think about the archive past, present, and indeed future. Thanks very much for listening.
Fantastic, thank you, Stephen. A reminder to those watching online, you're very welcome to contribute questions and comments that we'll come to once we've heard from all of the speakers. I'll go now to Síobhra, talking about other kinds and other forms of omission. You can, surely.
Sorry.
There you go.
Thanks, William.
No problem.
Yeah, so I think I can get going then. I'll see what time I'm at first, so 18. So I'll just say thanks to Jonathan for the invite to be here today, and I really enjoyed Stephen's paper there as well on that idea of the archive going into flames and the imagery and also the attachment to archives within this decade of commemorations. Which I think is also sometimes reflected to ideas of trauma as well. The idea that an event is very traumatic and then it leads to a repression of memory that then resurfaces at a later time, which is something I've been exploring in particularly work on the Civil War and how the Civil War was seen to be followed by a period of silence, but really when we look at the material that was published, that wasn't the case whatsoever. So in terms of what I'm going to do today, Jonathan asked me to reflect today on particularly the Irish language within the Decade of Commemorations. And that was an interesting thing to be asked because I'll be totally honest, and it was interesting listening to some of the speakers earlier about how interested they were in the Decade of Commemorations and maybe a sense of naivety at the outset. But I think from my perspective, I haven't been that tuned into the Decade of Commemorations, even though I've been very active in lots of different ways in various events and so on. But I think maybe as someone who happens to be an Irish speaker, and obviously my research doesn't just relate to the Irish language, it relates to various different maybe erase and silence issues in history. But I think as someone who happens to be an Irish speaker and who happens to speak Irish as a language at home and who happens to lecture in an Irish department, I think I probably share a certain scepticism at the outset regarding any kind of state initiative in terms of commemoration. And what I think I'll show now is that scepticism is certainly warranted when we think of how the Irish language has been really at the absolute margins of the Decade of Commemorations. And I think we'll look at some really striking examples of that. So I think if we go just a few, these were some of the other projects I suppose I was involved in. But again, looking at maybe areas that aren't always at the centre of the narratives, whether it's women's history, working class writing was something we looked at more recently, and then the question of the revolution in the north as well. But I wanted to start off the paper with, I suppose, one of the more striking controversies when we're talking about the Irish language in the Decade of Commemorations, and that was in 2014 when the website Ireland 1916 was released, and the text on the website was Google translated. So actually the proclamation, 1916 proclamation, was Google translated. And this actually did galvanise a bit of media attention at the time. I think it was even picked up at the BBC and it was seen as a very striking case. But as we'll look, this has actually been one of numerous cases. There's an article here from 2016, and it's a full article of all of the blunders in terms of language and Google Translate in the state centenary. So this was only the one example that was picked up on. But I think what I want to think about today is how is this indicative of the role for the Irish language in the commemorations. But I want to question, how is this at odds, number one, with the centrality of the language question to the revolutionary generation in a historical context, but also how it's at odds with the interests of the public in the present as well. And I think that's a really interesting way to tease it out. And when I was listening to some of the papers earlier, I was trying to think about it a little bit more, and I think what Margaret O'Caelainn said about the commemorations being about the relationship between Ireland and Britain, was that something to do with it? It's not actually about the people of Ireland or that question again, Micheál Martin, about not being about the post-colonial past and how we should look towards Europe. Is that another factor in this? Because there really was a brilliant opportunity here for the Irish language to be centralised and democratised within the centenary celebrations. So we'll move on then. What did I have next? So very quickly, Irish language as central to the revolutionary generation. This is probably something I'd work on more in a historical context, but there's no denying that if we think of Patrick Pearse and Níomhán Saoirse Gaelic, it wasn't just to be an independent Ireland but also a Gaelic Ireland, and also how it motivated a lot of revolutionaries, or certain revolutionaries, towards their political radicalisation. Ethna Coyle, an interesting example in this context, one of the most active Cumann na mBan members, writing in her memoirs about the trauma nearly when she first saw Irish in print, her native language in print. The tears began to flow as I could not read a single word of it. I cried all the way home. And that interaction, I suppose, with a language that had been concealed from her as a native speaker from Donegal in this case. It's also relevant in terms of how many revolutionaries were active in the Gaelic League, again how many revolutionaries' parents were Irish speakers. If we look at the census records, that they certainly were exposed to Irish. I know from working in the O'Malley interviews in the border areas, I can see there was a lot of Irish spoken among the parents of revolutionaries, that was a feature. And also the other question that was actually quite interesting we're looking at recently is how even during the revolutionary period, the areas in the west of Ireland, particularly in Connemara, were under a huge amount of pressure and dealing with a lot of poverty, and how that's not included in the narrative. I was recently writing about how when the treaty debates were happening in Dublin and there's tensions are escalating in between pro and anti-treaty sides, if we look at on Cleve Sullet, the Gaelic League paper, their front page headlines are the threats of famine in the west of Ireland, and that's something that we don't necessarily see in the revolutionary commemoration, that this was something that was very much happening at the time. So that just leads into the language itself. I won't go into too much detail, but it's one of 6 Celtic languages. We can see there the decline, the really rapid decline of the language in a period of 200 years. We won't go into the detail for all of the reasons of that, but it's a language that's under huge pressure in the traditional Gaeltacht areas up until the present day, and we can see that from the RIP graffiti that's written on Gaeltacht sign. But paradoxically, on the other side of that is we have growth of language in urban communities. We have a huge interest in Gael schools, in Irish medium education, both north and south. We have some legislation in terms of protection of the language in a legal context in the south. And at the moment there's huge campaigns for legislation or some kind of recognition of the language in the north. I would say though from experiences in the south that the legislation is incredibly important for a symbolic function, but oftentimes the services that should be available to Irish aren't available to Irish. An example was my husband when he was trying to get his COVID vaccine, said I'll ring the Irish line, and when he asked for an Irish speaker they put him through to another line, and they actually put him through to a Polish man, nearly as a joke in the office, you know. And I think that's just indicative of, I suppose, the disregard and the services not being provided, and then obviously you're not really going to be incentivised to use the services. In terms of the north, then obviously I'm working in Queen's in Belfast, campaign for language recognition. And I think even though I know how limited it is in the south, it's not going to do a huge difference. Nevertheless, up north I have nowhere to go to if I come across discrimination on language grounds among any of my students. I've no real support in that sense, and I'm left quite vulnerable. So that's why I suppose some kind of legal framework is really important. And then in terms of Decade of Commemorations, again, who has been overseeing this, again, is not a really enjoyable thing. So maybe this is why I haven't dwelled on this question all that much, because it's not actually a very positive case. But we have seen in the last number of years, in the last 10 years, a real disregard for the language at a political level. We had Joe McHugh appointed as Minister for Gaeltacht, and as he says, I was Little Irish. At least with Joe McHugh, he actually took this as an opportunity to go on a language journey, and he did encourage people to follow him on that language journey. That was followed then by Giuseppe Madigan, who actually said in an interview that she would not commit to taking language classes. And then more recently we have Jack Chambers TD. I think he's been attending a lot of events, but we can see here he's using Google Translate on his Twitter, and he wouldn't necessarily be competent enough to be interviewed on Radio na Gaeltacht or on a TV context, although he could read his speeches through Irish. So you can understand why there's probably an unease among Irish speakers. This is just from the Tour today. The headline is an article by an academic suggesting that the state are actually looking at what we're seeing here is a silent conspiracy to cast the language question aside. Also, a report from yesterday that less than 1% of social media posts by state bodies are in Irish. And we can see comments here from users saying this is how the language is being treated. Are we even surprised? A few language officers and a few more cartoons in Irish and we'll all be happy. Okay, so what I want to reflect on though is that's actually at odds. If we think of that 1% on social media, that's at odds with 10% of children going to Gael school and probably even 20% demand for the Gael schools that aren't actually there. So I think that's what's quite interesting. So then just in terms of what has been interesting and what more positive stories we can take, and I'll just keep an eye on my time, is that there were some really interesting programmes maybe at the start of the Decade of Centenaries. Commemoration, the Gaelic League here in Dublin, were very central in organising bilingual debates on really interesting topics. I know I was at the RTE main event the day after, or was it the day before, I can't remember, but in Easter 2016, and there was Irish on the programme. At the same time, it wasn't at the centre of the programme, and what you'll find then is that Irish is on the side and Irish speakers only go to that, where there probably was an opportunity for there to be bilingual events at the centre with interpreters for it to be open to all. In terms of documentaries then, there's been quite a few on TG Cahir. Seachtain na Cosca was really well received. I was involved in another documentary, Cogar of Raw, which I think is one of the more interesting documentaries in the last number of years. But at the same time, the documentaries are often targeted not at an Irish-speaking audience, but an English-speaking audience. So I think that's something to bear in mind. And even a lot of the production and the work in the background isn't actually in Irish. So I find that frustrating when I'm doing documentaries where the whole environment is in English. I'm given questions in English, I'm asked the questions in English, and I have to answer in Irish. But I'm speaking to myself, to the camera, and that's something I've actually said I won't do anymore. So I always make sure that if I'm doing something that I'm actually going to be able to communicate with somebody. Then a few other events in the north. There's been various events, community groups. Glornamona will be really pioneering in that context. And then just one to draw attention to, which I was involved in again, is the Irish Times for the last 2 years have had an Irish language article in their supplement. But the reason that actually was the case, I only realised this when I was researching this, is because the first year or 3 years ago, when they had no Irish language article in their supplement, it was actually brought up by Éamon O'Keefe, who was a Fianna Fáil politician, possibly in the Dáil, and questions that were raised were as to why was a supplement like this being funded by the Department of Gaeltacht if there was no Irish language material in it and it was being sent to all of the schools. And that's why since then there has been an effort. And I think that Irish Times have been credited to be including that, but there's a huge question there is why is Gaeltacht funding being used if it's not actually promoting the language in any way. And then another really interesting project, books. Huge number of books that have come out in the last 10 years. A series by the publisher Cushgame. There's also some really interesting historical biographies, some really interesting novels set in the revolutionary period. But the big issue here is that you can't get these books except if you go out of your way to go to the Irish language shops. So we have a total, I suppose, 0% visibility of the language in your major bookshops. And that would be the likes of Easton's that don't stock not only Irish language books but smaller presses anymore, and that's only happened in the last 10 years. Let's say when I was a teenager they would have stocked Irish language books, and it's no longer the case. So the last point I have, and hopefully I'm okay in time, is just a question on terms of academic scholarship, because the academic scholarship is reflecting this marginalisation of the language. Maureen Gowan, who's a really significant scholar who is in DCU, wrote an article quite recently suggesting that scholars are still ignoring the literary sources regarding 1916 that are written in the Irish language. And she cites a lot of the major commemorative texts and major publications the last number of years that seek to look at the legacies of 1916, yet no reference to any of the material. And this is particularly shocking given the sheer wealth of material and responses to 1916 in the Irish language, given that it was such a central aspect of the revolutionary project. I also wrote an article just last week connecting, I suppose, how social history and how could you study, how if you're only using monolingual English approaches, it's going to be very hard to write an accurate social history of Ireland. And this is something, again, that Maura Niana wrote just last week as well. And she actually goes a little bit further and says, how can you write a history when you're casting aside a whole section of the population. How can you tell stories, for example, about those who are missing and those who went and migrated in emigration? So I suppose connecting this not only to the Irish language but also to broader questions of social history and migration. But the reason I put these up here is there's a huge issue, because this is what the scholars are saying, but who's actually reading this work? Okay, so if Maureen Cohen is publishing this, I am actually thinking, did the scholars that she's criticising, and she does name them, they probably haven't even read that criticism and aren't aware of it. So what we're seeing is there that, again, it's like me being in front of a video camera in a room where talking to myself, that I'm not actually being listened to in that context. So I think that's where I'll finish but I suppose I didn't want to end this with the dictating that we must incorporate Irish language material, but I think if we continue to promote monolingual approaches, that we're going to only get a certain official history and vision of the past, and also an official and a blinded vision of the present as well, and the future.
Thank you so much, Síobhra. And empire and the question of empire in the Decade of Centenaries has already been raised today, and it strikes me that we can't address those questions in Ireland without looking to Irish language sources, without considering the language and the wider social questions that are connected to it in a way that you've raised, and I'm really pleased that you were here with us today to do that. By no means, I always say this last but by no means least, I really need to stop. I'm delighted that we're joined by Caelainn Hogan, who has done such important work in reclaiming some of the lost voices in Ireland, the voices that have been lost over the last 100 years, and has sought to give voice back to those that lost those voices over the last 100 years. And I think that I'm looking forward to a really important contribution to this discussion today from you, Caelainn. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks to Jonathan and Rebecca for setting this up, and really grateful to be here. And Síobhra and Stephen, thanks for your wonderful insights, and thank you all for being here. I thought I'd start just thinking back to when the Decade of Centenaries actually began, and before I actually started writing my book Republic of Shame about the religious run institutions. And I would have been reporting in Syria at the time on the conflict, and over sort of the course of when I started writing and reporting would have covered sort of independence movements and grassroots struggles, beginning in Kashmir, covering the independence of South Sudan, and then reporting on Syria. And so it was after sort of that experience of writing a lot about sort of systemic violence and sort of community and grassroots movements against that violence that I came back to Ireland in 2016 at the time of the centenary of the Rising, and soon began work on Republic of Shame. And it was really interesting, the sort of that point in time. It was a very pivotal year, I think, both 2016 and 2017, because it was soon after the marriage equality referendum, where I think those very difficult conversations about who gets to be a family and who gets the protections of a family in this state were being brought up by people opposed to marriage equality, and there was great pushback, I think, by people on, my family is my family, and neither church or state gets to tell me anymore what the ideal of that family should be. So I started writing the book at that time, and I was speaking to survivors, but also sort of investigating and researching the sort of landscape of religious run institutions in the country, traveling around the country to sites of the former mother and baby home institutions and Magdalen laundries. And it was really striking to see the sort of, all the sort of propaganda and sort of the visual representations of the centenary and celebrating the centenary, new plaques and new sort of commemorations of that time around these cities, around these towns, and the complete lack of any sort of commemoration, or maybe not commemoration, but any consideration or acknowledgement of that landscape of these former institutions. So, you know, a short walk from the GPO, which, you know, in 2016 was sort of a centre point of these commemorations, and finding ways to help people interact and acknowledge this complex history, is the former Magdalen Laundry at Sean McDermott Street, which still to this day has nothing to mark the fact that this was an institution where hundreds, if not thousands, of women and girls were sent and incarcerated, some for their entire lives. And it's just a short walk from the GPO. The building is still there. You can still see the sort of tiled cross and the old fans of the laundry where women and girls were forced to labour unpaid for the nuns, often washing the laundry of government departments of the new state. And that was really striking to me, that this landscape was very much still hidden, and the testimonies of survivors were still not really being acknowledged or heard. And you know, looking back over the last decade as we've been marking these centenaries, there has been a breaking of silences around this sort of history of this hidden history for so long in Ireland. And I think that breaking of silences has been a real catalyst for change. You know, we see in 2013 the release of the McAleese report into the Magdalen Laundries, and the 2015 marriage equality referendum, moving on to repeal in 2018, and now in 2022, of course, the public debate around the National Maternity Hospital, you know, being built on lands owned by a private body set up by nuns who ran religious institutions where women and children were incarcerated. And I think we're seeing again this outpouring of stories and testimonies from survivors about the ongoing legacy of what I would describe as a de facto theocracy in Ireland. And I want today to sort of lead you through a short timeline that I think shows how the architecture of what I call the sort of shame industrial complex in Ireland was very much forming at the same time of this sort of revolutionary period, and at the time of this decade in Ireland. And so it very much is sort of a silenced history, I think, and one that we don't commemorate and we don't acknowledge. And even with the multiple reports into this system of institutions that the state has brought forth, even with the latest, the Mother and Baby Home, the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes, which came out last year, showing, claiming in the first page of that report that these institutions were refuges, using the word refuge to describe these institutions that incarcerated women and children, which called unmarried mothers, that terrible term, which called them offenders and penitents. And talking about archives, I think it's incredibly important access to those records, because they show in black and white the language that was used about these women and their children. In black and white, in records, calling women and girls who were pregnant outside of wedlock first offenders and multiple offenders and penitents. So to look back, I think, at how that system, how that shame industrial complex began to form, despite the sort of very radical and revolutionary ideas of equality that were sort of fostered during the revolutionary period, and then were sort of silenced and pushed back as we saw the nascent Irish state take shape, and the sort of responsibility for social services and care being handed over to the Catholic Church. In 1913, the Catholic Protection and Rescue Society was established, quote, to protect the faith of baptized Catholics in Ireland from proselytizing influences and to rescue baptized Catholics. The Catholic Protection and Rescue Society was responsible for repatriating or taking back many women and girls who were pregnant in England and bringing them back to Irish institutions. Again, to maintain the faith of their children, to protect the faith of their children. And that society continued to operate until just recently, as renamed as Kunov. So a very long legacy of the society that began in 1913. Of course, we have the 1913 lockout, and it was reading a piece by Peter Murray, and actually a paper that was mentioned to me by the wonderful Mary McAuliffe, who's done such important work in bringing the voices of women during that revolutionary period to the fore. And it was during the lockout when a 16-year-old worker called Mary E. Murphy at the Jacob's Biscuit Factory was charged with boxing another girl and calling her a scab. And she was sent for 1 month to High Park, the Magdalen Laundry run by the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity, which had been in operation for many years at that stage. And it was Larkin who actually, in opposing her detention in this institution, which was on the same grounds as the Magdalen Laundry, described the women incarcerated in that laundry as those who had forgotten their race, their sex, and their soul. And decrying the fact that an innocent girl would be put in the same vicinity as a home for fallen women. And her father actually said that he would rather see his daughter in Siberia than in such an institution. So this was the view of marginalized women and incarcerated women from even a very progressive and radical member of that sort of that revolutionary movement. In 1917, we see St. Patrick's Guild securing their office in Middle Abbey Street in Dublin and receiving local government funding. St. Patrick's Guild at the time, which would be handed over to the same Sisters of Charity that run or recently had the main shares in St. Vincent's Hospital Group, which is now going to be the landowners for the new National Maternity Hospital. At the time in 1917 was run by Mary Cruce, a laywoman. And sort of very quickly, within a few years, the Guild set up a babies' home in Mountjoy Square, and by 1923 there was a report that 41 children had died of marasmus in one of these institutions, but the doctor responsible for them had said that this class of children was predisposed to disease and wasn't surprised by the death rates. So we already see the architecture of this shame industrial complex, of this system of institutions forming. The pamphlet that I found actually in the diocesan archives in Dublin for St. Patrick's Guild had a sort of a motto that was "Save the child, you save the nation." And they described their work as national. The work is national, it is Irish, it is Catholic. So you see this formation of the idea of an Irish nationalism, fundamentally entwined with the idea of Catholic identity and faith, and children, being at the centre of that battle over establishing authority and power before the Irish state is actually established. And within that pamphlet as well, I remember them sharing the story of a young woman almost boasting about their work with her, and she had been describing how she had lied to her mother that she was sick in hospital when actually she was giving birth in secret in an institution. But she expressed incredible trauma at that separation from her child and being unable to not think about him, constantly thinking of him and holding this secret inside of her. And so to think that the Guild was aware of the pain and trauma that it was causing mothers through these separations, but was using it in a pamphlet that was essentially advertising its services and looking for donations, I think really shows the awareness of the impact of these institutions and agencies. 100 years ago, in 1922, we have Bessborough, the institution in Cork, where more than 900 children died, an institution, mother and baby home institution that operated until 1998. It was set up 100 years ago by the Sisters of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary, actually an English congregation, English-based congregation, which came over here and at the bequest of local bishops and then of the state, set up 3 mother and baby home institutions, Bessborough, Sean Ross Abbey, where Philomena Lee was sent, and Castle Pollard. And as we know, hundreds of children died in this institution. And it was the local health board that first sent children from the workhouse to that institution. And I think, again, the history of the poor law and the workhouse system and the way that it was repurposed by the New Irish State is something that we've very much failed to acknowledge, I think, in the rhetoric around the commemorations. In fact, many of the mother and baby home institutions were set up on the grounds of former workhouses. The St. Patrick's mother and baby home on the Navan Road was a sort of poor law institution run by the Dublin Guardians, and was the largest mother and baby home institution in Ireland. And then, of course, Tuam, which we would all be familiar with, I hope, from the work of historian Catherine Corliss. The story of Tuam, where more than 800 children died, which broke in, I think, 2014 and sort of made headlines around the world about how children had died at this institution, but also how the bodies of infants and children were potentially buried in sewage tanks on the grounds of the Bon Secours institution. And it was in 2017 and 2016, around the same time of the sort of peak of these Decade of Centenaries, that it was confirmed by test excavations that there were significant human remains buried within sewage chambers on the grounds of this former institution. And those human remains, those infant and child remains, are still buried in sewage chambers on the grounds of the Tuam institution. And the government has delayed and failed to act for so long to actually exhume and potentially identify those remains. But I think there was a very interesting sort of correlation between that history of the sort of centenary of the sort of revolutionary period and that silenced history in the actual physical landscape at the burial site in Tuam. And I remember going to Tuam for the first time, and it's very strange. It's in the middle of a housing estate. There's a children's playground, and then in the corner there is the burial site, where we now know that infants and children were interred in sewage chambers. And there's one sort of wall remaining of that sort of old workhouse building, and on it there is a plaque that was actually sort of commissioned or set up by the Mother Superior of the Tuam institution. And it marks or pays tribute to the anti-treaty men who were executed against the wall of that institution in 1923. So the Tuam workhouse, which was operating since the mid-1800s, was actually occupied during the War of Independence by both British and Free State soldiers. And when in, I think it was 1925, children were moved from the Glenamady workhouse to the Tuam institution, it was actually delayed because there were still Free State soldiers living within the walls of that institution.
Yeah. Two minutes.
Perfect. Yeah, nearly done. Thank you. So I think it really struck me that there was this plaque on this wall commemorating what was called the Tuam martyrs, and yet beside that wall we have unmarked ground where potentially hundreds of infants and children are buried in sewage chambers with no acknowledgement. Only a sort of shrine that was set up by the local people living in that housing estate, an attempt to completely erase and silence the lives lost in that institution. And by 1924 as well, which was only a few years after this decade that we're marking, it was reported that 1 in 3 so-called illegitimate children were dying in Ireland. So 1 in 3 children who were born illegitimate in Ireland died in 1924. And that was at 5 times the rate of so-called legitimate children. And in that report to the government, this was known by the state, so-called illegitimate children were described as proof of a mother's shame. And then by 1929, there were a series of dull debates on what to do with unmarried mothers and propositions that there be a central institution for quote-unquote first offenders. So I'll just sort of at the end of the timeline there. But I think it's so important to acknowledge the changes that have been happening in this country in the last decade because of the breaking of silences around these testimonies and around these histories. But the sad reality that our state is still acknowledging these institutions as refuges and in many ways still silencing the testimonies of survivors.
Thank you so much. So we're very happy to take, well, I'm very happy on behalf of the panelists, we're very happy to take questions, both in the chat and in the room. And there's a question at the back from Sean.
Hello, yes. It's a 3-element question, if I will, to each of the corresponding panelists. So, Stephen, first of all, in relation to the archive, obviously there is this debate, and you'd mentioned it in your presentation, about whether or not the history contained there was essentially a commentary on colonial power in Ireland, rule in Ireland, and would that maybe be more reflective of that aspect of the imperial rather than the native history and so on and so forth, and what flows out of that in terms of its sense of value to the contemporaries at the time? I mean, Ernie O'Malley was an intellectual and would have appreciated, obviously, as the caption showed, the importance of that. But it's whether or not, as a result of the loss of that archive, whether or not, A, the colonial aspect of that has been completely explored properly and thoroughly, and B, whether the loss, whichever it is, has been weaponized. I was conscious in your piece, I hope I'm not misquoting now, but I think you said that Katrina Crowe had maybe laid blame on the anti-treaty side, and I'm a wee bit uncomfortable about whether you could necessarily just describe it like that. So I'd be interested in your view on that. Síobhra, now tama codge Gaeilge get the bug meragach tisagad tama sklachtan lim codge Gaeilge ach bawalium a choranul ma vekastich fahnian and the codge lech the hemula. So thank you, Síobhra, for putting the language back where it should be, because what I'd be interested to know from your good self is, you're quite right to say, to place it back in its proper place. We've talked today about commemoration being a vision, if you like, as much about the present and then for the future. But we have to remind ourselves the events that we're commemorating, they had a vision for the future. And the Irish language and returning the Irish language to the Irish people was very much central to that vision. And it just strikes me that any commemoration, if you're going to do that period any justice, that leaves the Irish language or marginalises the Irish language out of that, is not a proper representation of what you're trying to endeavour to do. So I'd be interested in your view on that. And finally, Caelainn, thank you so much. That was such an interesting talk. And it just was struck, and I'd be interested on your view. Do you think that this absolute neglect, this myopia with regards to commemoration, and what these dreadful institutions and the Magdalene Laundries and so on, and the state's lack, it's not just inertia, it's complete ignoring of it. Do you think that some of that, and this is not an excuse, but does some of that lie in the roots that in post-revolutionary Ireland, we saw this whole slew in the 20s and 30s of legislation that was brought in by the new nascent Irish independent state, which was very much anti-women, and was putting the woman's place firmly in the home and nowhere else, and that to go back now and actually do justice to what happened to women at that stage with these institutions is to open up a deeper, wider, more awkward question for the state, which it doesn't want to go there. And do you think, is that possibly why they've been so slow to get to that point? Gurmagit.
Thanks. We'll take the questions in the order that they were posed, I think.
Yeah. So the question about whether or not the reconstituted archive or the archive, if it had survived, would have helped us understand colonialism. I think the destruction of the archive is in itself a document of colonialism, right? So I think that we all know that, the bonfire at the end of the empire, as it's called, that this happens quite a lot, where like they destroy documents. Woods actually mentions in his introduction that the Lord Lieutenant used to actually bring home papers to Britain whenever he left his post. So actually that used to happen, so that all the papers of Ireland, of the Irish rule, was actually taken back, which is probably why some of it can be reconstituted. I don't really know. I think the fact that it can be reconstituted in any way sort of suggests that it's less about the records themselves and about the centralisation of those records, something we might kind of maybe think about that way. And indeed that the fact that you could actually destroy a centralised body of knowledge in Ireland is in itself a kind of testament to the colonial legacy of Ireland, and that it was actually centralised in Dublin as opposed to anywhere else as well. I think there's something in that Woods actually reflects this, I think, in a later thing. As regards to whether or not the anti-treaty or treaty side, I have to say, I have a firm view in that, which you would probably be able to guess at, but I don't really care. I think that, I don't think that Churchill gave the anti-treaty people. That's all. I'll leave it at that. You know what I mean? Yeah. Right. I'll leave it at that. I don't want to get shouted at on Twitter. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm at a loss. Síobhra.
I suppose just on the question of the language and how it features, I think one of the things that's actually quite striking in, let's say, history of the revolutionary period, there's been a lot of question of how revolutionary was the revolution, and particularly in terms of social concerns, and there's a lot we could go there. But I think one of the places where it was actually revolutionary was the Gaelic revival, and I think we see the legacy of that even today, that the language is still standing, although it's under a huge threat. We see it in our names, my own name, Donal, Caelainn, that these are names that were revived during that period. The legacies of that are really quite remarkable when we think of the revolutionary generation and bringing Irish into the public sphere, and the names is such a striking example of that. So I think definitely if you want to give due credit to the aims and ambitions of the revolutionary generation, that has to be something that has to be considered. And I think as well the question of placing Irish at the centre is not about excluding non-Irish speakers. It's actually giving people an opportunity to engage with the language if they want, and also then to offer services like interpreters for those who don't have access to it. And that's why it's a shame about the social media, because I think social media is actually a great place to give people snippets of information about services, and that gives people exposure and normalises the language, and that's something that's not being done at all at the moment. There is a lot of plans. There's legislation that's, I think, gone through about 20% civil service of the civil service to be Irish speakers, but again a lot of that is plans, and whether that's realised is another question in itself. And we might ask, well, why isn't that already the case, that the language would be some kind of requirement, because a lot of that has been peeled back in recent times, so there's an effort to reintroduce that, but we'll see, I suppose. But I do think it's something that only enriches your scholarship and your interpretation, and I think it should be seen as something like that to embrace, and I think it doesn't belong to anybody either. Anyone who has a couple of focal, or anyone who wants to pick up a couple of focal, that's actually half of the battle. And you do find often that it's international scholars who are studying that's in Irish scholars in Irish studies who be more open to the language maybe than people born on this island.
Thanks, Síobhra. I'm going to abuse my position and take an opportunity to add a question, if that's okay. Yeah, there is. But I just want to
use your position quite a lot.
Yeah. Hey, it's my party. Because there's been a lot in the discourse and the practice of the Decade of Centenaries about the role of women in the revolution, and about the reclamation of the story of women in the revolution. And I just wonder, or in the revolutionary period more widely, and I just wondered how that sits against the kinds of silencing and omission that you and others have worked to correct in that same decade, over the course of the Decade of Centenaries. There seems to be a bit of a tension, I think, there that I'm interested in, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been really important attempts to bring many of those voices forward now and sort of reclaim those testimonies, but it's still an uphill battle. Answered that I think the government is avoiding. I think a really interesting example to think of is when the Department of Justice was found to have been monitoring social media posts in relation to direct provision that were, criticising and exposing that very cruel system of direct provision. And within those sort of reports on those social media points, there was posts. There was a directive to pay close attention to any posts that mentioned the mother baby home institutions or Magdalen laundries in relation to direct provision. And I think that's very telling as to how powerful it has been as people learn about the role of the state in funding these institutions, in being complicit with the incarceration of women and children, in helping to fund and operate this system of institutions, and questions about how that system was normalized and perpetuated by people in power, and how similar systems that fund private institutions and bodies to operate institutions where rights are being denied and huge harm is being caused, how those systems are normalized still today. And I think to recognize as well that when we talk about the state and who was responsible for these institutions in the last century, that it was mainly a Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael government that was overseeing this system. So they are deeply implicated in the injustices that were perpetuated through the system. In fact, it was a Fianna Fáil TD who, in a county council meeting in Galway, called for the Tuam institution to remain open when it was threatened with closure because it was a fire hazard and it was so dangerous for the children living in that institution, and the cost was too much for the state. The state wasn't willing to pay to repair it to a humane standard. But there was a Fianna Fáil TD who warned that the council would lose the benefit of the money spent there in that institution if it was to close. And actually there's been, I recently reported about how that same Fianna Fáil political dynasty that same family fostered a child from the Tuam institution who testified to being abused in their home. And there was a debate, I remember as well, in the Dáil where I think it was Haughey was Minister for Justice at the time, and there was, I believe, a Labour senator who spoke out about how women were being treated, quote unquote, as slaves in these institutions and kept there for 2 years, and challenged the government on why these mothers couldn't be treated equally and sent to maternity hospitals along with other mothers and allowed and supported to keep their children. And I think Haughey replied with something along the lines of, I have no function in regard to that. So, the government today is deeply responsible for this system, and I think that is a reason why we see words like refuges used about these institutions, and why there has been an ongoing campaign to silence the testimonies of survivors.
Thank you. Are there any? Yes, Matthew.
This is just a very quick question for Stephen. You were talking about heroic archivists. Have you encountered any sort of stories of, I suppose, lazy or accidental archivists? I'm thinking of, and I don't know necessarily how true these are, stories from genealogy circles up north of the border where a lot of the census stuff survives for very boring reasons, like somebody called it before the Four Courts fire and then they forgot to return it. So these just sort of keep turning up. And does that add anything to the story, or is that a silence? And again, a lot of this is happening in the north, not the south. Does that get have any impact on it? Thank you.
It's a really important. I mean, I meant to qualify by saying there is either only lazy or heroic, right? So yes, there is obviously this kind of narrative, and I think again to go back to Woods, which is one example at least I can give that's relevant. That like there is an idea of preserving these. That we are good archivists. We preserve this for the common good, and that idea of that. I haven't really come across any particular. I mean, I can think of various ones I'm probably not allowed to say because it's not my story, but say of poets in Monaghan's, from Monaghan's archives being on the back of a truck or something like that. But there's only one Monaghan poet, of course. Apologies to any others. But the things that you find is quite a lot in literary archives and stuff as well. That that they aren't really that well collected. But also that it depends on what they are as well. Like even in major national institutions, you might find that one particular archive isn't as well catalogued as another because it isn't as used. But no, in terms of the construction of it, I mean, I think it's less Herculean than Sisyphean. That's kind of the way that people should see archives, not as being like this reconstructive or heroic effort, but maybe a punishment, which is what it is if anyone's done one.
Great. Any other questions? We haven't got any on the YouTube chat at the moment. Yes, Dominic. Yeah.
Can I try and push your comment there, John? When you get that, I mean, if we look at the way that gender had been covered through the centenary, I mean, there's been fantastic work done by people like Margaret Ward. Margaret Ward's work goes well back beyond this, and then you end up with those pictures of women on the side of the bus. So there's a shift there, which is quite interesting. I think this is what you were getting at, John. There, I think it's worth recognising the tension between what is a deeply misogynistic and patriarchal world that we know existed then and we know existed a long time after, and the creation of a number of figures as heroes in the public eye. And I don't know the answer to this because obviously we want to know those histories and they should be out there. But was this what you're sort of suggesting, John, that there's a tension in that depiction which says quite a lot about what we might want to say now about gender, and is probably a bit more problematic about what was actually the conditions then, if I'm not sure if I'm putting that well.
I guess to me, what really emerged from what you were talking about is the total absence of any commemoration of the centenary of the opening of Bessborough versus the image of Constance Markovich, for example, that defined the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising. Do you know, there's that really, and what does that say about, and I think you've already spoken to it, that there are people in power now who are still complicit in these processes of, I think that's, really central to what I've taken from what your contribution is, Caelainn. Yeah. Yes, Donal, sorry.
I just wanted to ask Síobhra a question about what you think, contemporary discourses around Irish language, particularly in the South, the shift, let's say, from this idea of Gaelscoileanna as a kind of cultural project, a marginal cultural project, perhaps connected to republicanism and quite subversive, to the trope, which is inaccurate, we know, of Gaelscoileanna as a kind of a middle class, upwardly mobile, which is not borne out in the statistics. But how does that relate then to this new nation building project that we see around the commemoration? Because it seems to me there seems to be a link between that and the Inspire Ireland video at the start of the 1916. So this kind of stripping back of the national identity into a neoliberal order, and that placing the Gaelscoileanna, which are still a radical social project, often secular, outside of the norm, into that project as a convenient way to badge away the kind of radical legacies you're talking about.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, Donal. I can't say I've seen a huge amount of that in terms of the Gaelscoil discourse, but maybe you can send it to me because, as I said, I haven't been necessarily thinking about commemoration or the Decade of Commemoration in a very critical way up until I got asked to come and do this panel. But I think I think it's definitely a question that there is a lot of misinterpretations around the Gael Scoilna. We know from the statistics that they're generally more working class areas. There might be one or two examples, but even if we take South Dublin, for example, the high performing Gael Scoilna would be maybe associated with a snobbery, yet they're one of the few non-fee paying schools in actually this area. So again, even that trope is inaccurate. So I think there definitely has been a development. I don't think the Gael Scoilna fit necessarily a set mode, but what we do find with the Gael Scoilna is that the state support is lacking, and that a lot of them were set up by parents groups, and that the government has been quite reluctant to set up new Gael Scoilna, and it's still a constant battle. There was protests outside the Dáil this year for particularly second level Irish medium education to cater for the Bun Scoilna, and even then the amount of Irish medium schools, it doesn't satisfy the demand. So I don't know if they can, if maybe there'd be an attempt to place it as a kind of more respectable model, but I don't know if that's been successful, and particularly if we see that the protests are still ongoing, and obviously similarly in the north, where it was really quite radical in that the Bunscoil Public first actually had their 50-year commemoration, if that was something to include this year, and that really started off with a group of families with maybe about 6 children with prefabs, and it was only it wasn't recognised obviously by the state, and the parents raised money from the community in order to pay the teacher's salary until finally it was acknowledged. So that's definitely something to maybe include in this volume as well in terms of commemorations.
Thank you so much. It's 3:15 now, so we'll break for 15 minutes and reconvene for the final panel. But I just want to thank all the contributors today.